Think about the soda aisle for a second. You walk up to it, you grab your favorite brand, and right there next to the regular version are two options that, at first glance, seem identical. One says diet, the other says zero. Both promise zero sugar, 0 calories, and insist they taste just as good as the original. So naturally, the question is, why do both exist? Most people assume that one must be healthier than the other, or that one is newer and replaced the old one. Others swear that one tastes way better, even though the nutrition label looks basically the same. Because when you actually stop and look at the facts, it gets confusing pretty fast. They both have the same amount of calories, the same sugar count, and usually the same amount of caffeine. On paper, they look like the same drink wearing different clothes. And yet, soda companies spend millions of dollars making sure both versions stay on shelves. They don't quietly phase one out or merge them together. They actively promote both as if they are totally different products, which tells us something important. This is not an accident, and it's not redundancy. There's a reason diet soda came first. There's a reason zero soda showed up decades later, and there is a reason that neither one has gone away. Because the real difference between diet and zero soda has almost nothing to do with nutrition and everything to do with how we think, how we taste, and how soda companies learn to sell the same idea twice. Now, before this turns into some long debate about health, calories, or which one is secretly worse for you, it does help to clear something up early. Diet and zero soda are not competing because one is healthier. From a nutritional standpoint, they are basically twins. Both are zero sugar, both have 0 calories, and there's no real meaningful difference on the label that would actually change your day. If you lined them up side by side and covered the names, there would be nothing on the nutritional facts that explain why one should exist and why the other should not. And that's what makes this so interesting. Because soda companies, they're not careless. They don't spend decades building brands, running ad campaigns, or reserving shelf space for products that serve no purpose. If diet and zero were truly interchangeable, one of them would have disappeared a long time ago. So the difference has to be living somewhere else. And it lives in how they're made, how they taste, and more importantly, how they're framed in your mind before you even take a sip. One was created in an era where diet meant compromise. The other was created in an era where people still wanted the original experience, just without the sugar. Once you stop looking at diet versus zero as a health decision and start looking at it as a design and marketing decision, everything else starts to make sense. And to understand why zero soda even needed to exist in the first place, you've got to go back to when diet soda was first introduced, and what it was originally trying to be. Diet soda didn't start as a mainstream product. It dates back to the 1950s and 60s, when it was created primarily for people who either couldn't consume sugar or were actively trying to avoid it. These people included diabetics, weight loss consumers, and people whose priority was reducing calories, not enjoying the full soda experience. Taste wasn't the main goal. In fact, early diet sodas tasted very different from their regular counterparts. They were thinner, harsher, and often had a noticeable aftertaste. But that was acceptable at the time, because the trade-off was clear. You were giving something up in exchange for fewer calories. And that idea became baked into the name itself. The word diet was never about flavor. It was about restrictions. It told you up front that this was the version where something had been removed. It had less sugar, indulgence, and enjoyment, at least when compared to the original. For decades, that framing worked. Diet soda wasn't trying to replace regular soda. It was an alternative for a specific type of consumer, and people accepted that it was never going to taste exactly the same. But as soda culture changed and expectations around taste increased, that framing started to become a problem, and over time the word diet began to carry more meaning than the drink itself. At some point, diet soda didn't change, but the world around it did. Over time, the word diet started to pick up baggage. It stopped being a neutral description and became loaded with ideas of restriction, guilt, and diet culture. For a lot of people, especially younger consumers, it just didn't sound appealing anymore. Even people who regularly drank diet soda rarely loved the name. They just drank it because it was familiar or because they had been drinking it for years, not because the label felt modern or exciting. Meanwhile, consumer expectations were shifting. People wanted products that felt intentional, optimized, and designed, not products that felt like a compromise. Saying something was diet started to sound like admitting something was missing. This created a strange problem for soda companies. I mean, they had spent decades refining formulas, improving sweeteners, and getting closer to the taste of regular soda. But they were still selling it under a name that implied sacrifice. And that meant, no matter how good diet soda became, the label itself was holding it back. So instead of fixing the formula, soda companies realized they needed to fix the framing. And that is where Zero Soda enters the picture. Zero Soda didn't appear because diet soda failed. It appeared because diet soda stopped sounding appealing. By the time Zero versions started rolling out in the 2000s, soda companies had a different problem on their hands. They could make a zero-calorie soda that tasted much closer to the original, but the word diet still told consumers to expect a downgrade. Zero fixed that without changing the promise. The word zero doesn't suggest sacrifice. It doesn't imply weight loss or restriction nearly as much as the word diet. It simply tells you that there is zero sugar, and nothing else is being taken away. This wasn't just a name change. Zero sodas were positioned as normal soda that had been optimized. Same bold flavors and identity, just without the sugar. And the branding reflected that. The packaging was darker, there was a stronger contrast, and the fonts were more aggressive. Ads even focused on taste instead of restraint. Zero Soda wasn't asking you to choose the healthy option, it was asking you to choose the one that still felt like soda. In other words, Zero Soda was the same idea as diet soda, but rebuilt for a generation that didn't want to feel like they were dieting. Up until this point, everything sounds like branding, and that's because a lot of it is. But there is one real physical difference between diet and Zero Soda, and it lives in the formula. Most traditional diet sodas rely on a single primary sweetener, usually aspartame. It gets the job done, but it does come with a downside. Aspartame has a sharper finish and a more noticeable aftertaste, especially when it's doing all the work on its own. Zero sodas, though, take a different approach. Instead of relying on one sweetener, they usually use a blend. Aspartame is still there in many cases, but it's paired up with another sweetener like acesulfame potassium, often called ACE-K. Blending sweeteners smooths out the flavor. One sweetener hits fast, the other lingers differently, and together they mask each other's weaknesses. The result ends up being a taste that feels fuller and closer to the original sugar version. And this is why people often describe Zero Soda as smoother, cleaner, and more like the real thing. It isn't necessarily sweeter overall, but the experience is more balanced. While Diet and Zero look identical on a nutrition label, the way they're engineered to taste is not exactly the same. And that difference becomes very obvious once you start paying attention to how people react to each one. If you have ever heard people argue about Diet versus Zero Soda, you already know this part matters more than anything else. Some people say Diet tastes awful, others say Zero tastes wrong. And what's interesting is that neither group is really talking about quality. They are talking about familiarity. Diet soda has a sharper profile and a more noticeable aftertaste. For someone who didn't grow up drinking it, that can be jarring. But for longtime diet drinkers, that taste is the point. It is what the soda is supposed to taste like to them. Zero Soda hits differently though. It tends to taste slightly sweeter up front and fade more clearly. For new drinkers, it feels closer to regular soda. For some diet loyalists, it feels off or artificial. This is why taste debates around soda get so emotional. People aren't comparing two drinks in a vacuum. They're comparing them to the version of soda they trained their brain on years ago. And once your taste memory locks in, switching just feels wrong, even if the formula is technically smoother. And that explains why Zero didn't replace Diet, and why diet drinkers didn't suddenly convert overnight. Taste isn't just chemistry, it's a habit. Once you step back and look at Diet and Zero Soda side by side, the branding differences start to feel intentional. Diet soda packaging is usually lighter, silver, white, softer colors. The branding leans clean and minimal, subtly signaling that it's a health-conscious choice. It doesn't try to draw attention to itself. Zero Soda, though, goes in the opposite direction with darker cans, higher contrast, and bolder fonts. The goal is to make it feel closer to the original full sugar version, not a replacement for it. The marketing follows the same pattern. Diet soda has historically been advertised around lifestyle, moderation, and control. Zero Soda ads focus on taste, performance, and intensity. There's also a demographic shift happening here. Diet soda was traditionally marketed toward women. Zero Soda was positioned to be more gender neutral and in many cases deliberately masculine. None of this is accidental either. Soda companies aren't just selling a drink, they're selling an identity, and by offering both diet and zero, they can speak to different audiences without forcing anyone to change. Which brings up an obvious question. If zero is newer, better tasting, and more appealing to younger consumers, why not just get rid of diet altogether? From the outside, it looks redundant. Two sodas with the same amount of calories and sugar, but slightly different taste. It feels like one should replace the other by now. But that would be a huge mistake. Diet soda has decades of brand loyalty behind it. I mean, there are people who have been drinking it for most of their lives, if not their entire life, and they're not interested in switching. For them, diet isn't some alternative. It's the default. Zero soda, on the other hand, brings in new drinkers. People who never liked diet soda and avoided it because of the name, and people who want something that feels closer to regular soda. By keeping both, soda companies avoid alienating either group. They also gain something else that's easy to overlook: shelf dominance. Two versions mean more space in stores, more visibility, and more perceived choice. Choice matters, and when people feel like they're choosing between options, they feel more in control, and that makes them more likely to buy. So instead of fighting each other, diet and zero work together. They cover different preferences, different identities, and different generations, all while selling the same core idea. All that, though, leaves one final question. What is the actual takeaway for the person holding the can? At the end of the day, the difference between diet and zero soda isn't about health. You aren't choosing the healthier option. You aren't making a better nutritional decision. On paper, they are almost identical, and for most people, that difference is meaningless. What you're actually choosing is a flavor profile and a feeling. Diet soda comes from an era where cutting calories meant accepting a trade-off. Zero soda comes from an era where people still want the full experience, just without the sugar. Neither one is right or wrong. I mean, they were built for different expectations. Zero exists because diet stopped sounding cool. Diet still exists because millions of people genuinely prefer it. And instead of replacing one with the other, soda companies learned that it was better to let both coexist. So, if you've ever wondered which one you should drink, the answer is pretty simple. Ignore the label, ignore the marketing, and drink the one that tastes right to you. Because, in the end, diet versus zero isn't an actual health debate. It's a branding story hiding inside a soda can.